Welcome back, everybody. I was not kidding when I said that governance is one of our most requested sort of hot topics in taxonomy land. So I doubled up on it this year. So we have another session where we're going to deep dive into a couple of special topics around governance. One is going to be on life cycle management of terminology. And the other one is going to be on information governance as a service. And we're going to start with lifecycle management. That's going to be presented by my dear friend, Aaron Lehnert, who's Senior Manager at Synaptica. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. All right, so I'm going to share my desktop. I'm going to try and share the right one. Hopefully this is it. Go to slideshow and do full screen here. Okay. Okay, so as Stephanie mentioned, my name is Aaron Lehnert. Thanks everybody for coming to this talk on taxonomy governance, life cycles, and versioning. So I'm Aaron Lehnert, the Senior Manager for Graphite at Synaptica. So I've been in this industry for almost 20 years now. As you can see by my very simplified timeline here, the only 3 dates that matter: when I was born, when I became a taxonomist, and when I started talking to you, which is now. So I live in Oakland, California. I've listed some of my likes and dislikes here. I'm a very avid swimmer and love to do traveling and photography, and I don't like celery. There's other things I don't like, but that's one that sticks out for me. So a little bit about my company, Synaptica. So we've been providing taxonomy software and services for over 25 years. In fact, last year was our 25th year anniversary, which we couldn't really celebrate with anybody in person, but we tried to make the best of it. And generally, we work very closely with our customers to build the functionality they need into our taxonomy and ontology products, and you'll see some of that come through as I give my presentation here. Some of the functionality that's in our software came straight from our clients. So I'm going to talk to you today about the life cycles of taxonomy concepts and taxonomies, or lists, or thesauri, or ontologies, and on and on and on. And since we're talking about concepts and taxonomies from conception to retirement, including reaching maturity, I am comparing this to the human life cycle. So we can go through, I think we'll all be able to relate to this some. So let's talk the taxonomy preconception. We have a vague notion that taxonomies are a thing. We've seen them around. We've heard them. We know other people have them, like kids. Something has happened, but perhaps we're not quite sure what yet. And eventually, something happens. Besides freaking out, what do we do? Well, we can start planning, and maybe we know we'll never really think of everything, but at least we can get started and plan. So if we compare the formation, the birth of our taxonomy, our wee little taxonomy probably starts life in Excel or some other spreadsheet. It's very common. Its faculties are a bit limited, and it's a bit of a mess because it's young. Some poor taxonomist got hired as the nursemaid and has to deal with swaddling this poor spewing mess of a thing that is your just newly born taxonomy. And then we get into infancy. So as your taxonomy reaches infancy, you add a little more sophistication. This involves some homegrown processes and technologies to manage the taxonomy, pretty common. May still be in spreadsheets, but maybe you're shifting those spreadsheets around between this system and that system, importing and exporting, going between them. You may even start thinking about prep schools already. I mean, let's get this taxonomy started. So you put your taxonomy in a homegrown taxonomy management system, or something which perhaps wasn't really designed to house taxonomies, like SharePoint Term Store. Didn't hear that from me. Not exactly my favorite for managing taxonomies, as you may have guessed. Then we get into childhood. Now your taxonomy processes are a bit feral. The taxonomy itself is run amok. It's making messes. It's causing a stir. There are some user-suggested keywords. There are multiple concepts with different labels, which mean exactly the same thing. And there's out-of-date concepts which have never been used. Maybe your taxonomist has even given up the taxonomy for adoption and fled. Here, you take this and take care of it. I can't be bothered with it anymore. But let's say the taxonomist sticks around. Now your taxonomy gets into adolescence. So it's moody, it's reclusive. Sometimes it's a bit of a messy jerk, but it's also coming to its own. It's discovering who it is and what it wants to be. The processes are running more smoothly now. It's clear as to what it's becoming. In short, your taxonomy has a future at this point. Okay, then you get into adulthood. So your little taxonomy is all grown up. It's left the home of spreadsheets and moved into its own place, a proper taxonomy management system. It is a job providing centralized vocabularies as metadata, and it's grown its own network of integrated consuming systems. Your taxonomy is now a fully mature, fully functioning member of a greater information architecture and ecosystem. So what did we miss? We've left something out. What happened to old age, retirement, and death? Well, if you manage the taxonomy correctly, it never dies. Oh, sure, concepts, perhaps whole structures may get retired, but the taxonomy itself really lives forever. It is your David Bowman. I'm a big 2001 fan, if you haven't noticed. It's your star child, right? It reaches old age and retirement, but it sort of comes back. It never really dies. This is sort of a goal for your taxonomy, is to live forever. So let's talk a little bit about the concept and taxonomy life cycle in this framework. So we're going to look a little more specifically at each of the components which make this life cycle possible, particularly focusing on the taxonomy in adulthood being managed in a proper taxonomy management system. So let's first talk about concept status. Concept status is a way to determine where a concept is in its life cycle. So I'm using some generalized concept statuses here to convey the idea. In most scenarios, the taxonomy is continually being worked on with some concepts in a candidate status and others in a published status. So here are the statuses that we typically talk about. Candidate terms, they're added, but they haven't gone through any approval workflow. Candidate terms can include user-suggested concepts if you allow such a thing in your taxonomies. So approved concepts, there we go. Approved concepts have been reviewed, but aren't yet ready for consuming systems. They've been reviewed, they're ready to go, but they're not yet published out. And so we get to the next phase, which is published concept. These are live production taxonomy concepts. They're being consumed by other systems, whether they are web, content, digital asset management, or other systems. And finally, we can have withdrawn concepts. Those have been pulled out of the workflow for one reason or another. They were live, but are now in a state ready for review, change, or possibly even retirement. So let's talk about this workflow. We can see some possible concept lifecycle paths. So I'm going to click through this. First, a candidate concept is directly added to the taxonomy or suggested by an end user. And I always sort of put a little caveat around this. This works for some organizations, it doesn't work for others. You may not want candidate concepts, other people do, and they may come from those end users, right? Next, the concept is pending review from taxonomists, so these could be subject matter experts, whoever's going to review these concepts to be approved and moved on. So now it's been reviewed. So was it approved or rejected? Did we like this concept? Do we like its definition? Do we like the other attributes that are surrounding it? If it's rejected, it goes back to a review. If it's approved, we can say we're ready, it's published to use by consuming systems. Once published, the concept can be moved back to any prior state and be pending review again. Okay. But the concept could also be withdrawn, we could say deprecated, and left in the taxonomy indefinitely. We don't use it, but we want to keep track of it. We want to have a history of this thing and know where it came from and where it went. And then it's possible it could be deleted. Now, this doesn't happen a lot because once you've been published, once it's been out there, you typically don't want to delete it and erase the record of its existence, right? So if it's been deleted, that's a little more serious. You have to really look at the consuming systems and what's happening downstream to understand how that's going to impact. So on this next slide, we can look at an alternate workflow which is if you replace that that review with, does the concept need to be merged or replaced? Okay. It could be merged or replaced with an existing concept. So the life cycle is essentially the same, but there's an interaction with another existing concept or concepts. Okay. And then finally in this workflow, we're coming to the end of the usefulness of the concept. In old age, it is either retired or it passes away. And again, probably not deleted, but it may be removed from view and no longer used. Okay, so audit logs. Through all of these changes, we have several ways to keep track. The taxonomy management system has system level tools which track changes. And in this case, there's an audit log of all the changes made to a single concept. So you can see here, this is one example where I can get into a system and I can look at what's happened to the concept over its life cycle. And this is really where those mature taxonomy management systems come in, because doing this kind of tracking in Excel or some other more manual process going to mean that you're going to have to plug in that information, or it's going to be captured in a way that's not really transmissible to consuming systems, which is that's difficult. There's also a human component. So users can manually enter governance and lifecycle information in the form of review notes, review dates, other properties containing information about what changes were made, when, and why. So this information lives with the concept information as part of the overall information and context of the concept. Some information is for end users, like definitions, scope notes, alternate labels. Some are for internal use only, like editorial comments and reviewer notes. So you can see here in this image that we've got some properties and relationships set up that are strictly around governance. Okay, and on the front end, governance properties and relationships can be viewed by the users with the appropriate permissions. So you can see here, these are really properties that I'm showing to the front end. Somebody who's a subject matter expert, a taxonomist can get in here and they can fill these fields out. So some of them could be editable, and if you have a system that can do this, what's really nice is to be, some things are editable while others are view only, to say, yeah, I looked at the definition, I can't change it, but I can comment on it. I could, perhaps, say I would suggest these changes and I can add a date. So having that range of editable and sort of read-only or view-only properties is quite helpful. Okay, so let's talk about the higher level, not at the concept, but at the taxonomy level. So on the macro scale, a taxonomy or other interrelated taxonomies can be copied and versioned for lifecycle management. Why do we want to do this? Sometimes it's for archival references. Here's the taxonomy frozen at this date and time, so we know what it looked like. It could be for backup and restore. Now that's less of a use case. Often that's done on the back end with database backups, but people, you know how taxonomists are. We love our baby taxonomies. We've raised these things. We don't want to see them disappear. So I think we get a little paranoid. We might want to back it up ourselves and store it somewhere that we can have a duplicate copy. That's not a bad idea, really. Another thing you can do with a version is A/B testing between two versions. You can keep your taxonomy that's WIP, work in progress, right? It's moving forward, but you could also freeze a copy at a point in time, or freeze several copies at different points of time and compare them and see what changes looked like and how those changes impacted. And a use case we've heard is freezing these taxonomies so that they can be fed into machine learning models, so you know exactly what went in when, and be able to understand what those models and those algorithms were generating. So archival reference, again, could be used to see how the taxonomy was structured or how a retired version looked at any given point. And yeah, getting back to the machine learning, point-in-time models can be referenced to see how any given machine learning model is performing and what data set went into the model. When we talk about machine learning and AI, what some of the concepts that we hear are transparency and explainability. If you have a version of a taxonomy and say, here's exactly what it was when I put it in that machine learning model on this date, then you can have more transparency and explainability into its algorithms that generated a certain outcome. So in this scenario, and I'm going to walk through here, the main taxonomy is copied and this is versioning for archiving, and each version can be given a new name. So we've got a single taxonomy. Here's a version. In this particular instance, I'm taking a monthly snapshot, but yet my taxonomy, my WIP, my work in progress goes on into the future. So I've never really changed it. I'm just spinning out these versions so that I can keep them over time to see how this taxonomy has changed. Okay, so these taxonomies can be stored within the system, so a taxonomy management system, and or can be stored in another location, such as a content management system, and maybe both. I mean, we're doing redundant backups here. We're saying I'm storing it in the system. Should there be some kind of catastrophic, disaster with your system, it's saved in another system. And again, a lot of these backups are done on the back end too. So you're really creating copies of copies, like Agent Smith over there. Um, but this is redundancy that as long as you're not just clogging up your content management system with a bunch of unnecessary garbage and copies, this can be reverted back to, in case of any kind of incident. Okay, so these copies can be, as I said, stored within the system, and I've got an example here of what this looks like. You've got some archive skis, and this particular one is a public thesaurus gem, and I've just put a date after it. Said, here's when I took a snapshot, here's when I took another snapshot. I'm just creating versions. And again, I could export it. And if you're going to be using a content management system, you want to make sure that taxonomy management system can export it in files that make sense. There's some examples. CSV and Excel, kind of no-brainers, but then RDF, Trig, a lot of these portable files that are standards, probably want to have those at your disposal as well. Let's talk a little bit about taxonomy forking. So when you talk about forking, it's creating a copy of a taxonomy as a template. So really what we're saying here is I've got my taxonomy A, and I'm cloning it. And if you've been watching Foundation, got a little clip there of Cleons, they're all clones, right? I'm cloning this thing, and I can use that clone for many different reasons. I can say, I love this taxonomy and all the relationships and different fields that I have set up for it. I'm going to copy that, and I may or may not keep the concepts within it and use that as a template and spin out another taxonomy. Or again, I might say, that my work in progress, it keeps going, but I've spun out different copies to do different kinds of testing and experimentation on. And I know that it's not the original. I know it's different, but that's okay. As long as I maintain my core version, I can spin out these other copies, make changes to them, experiment a little bit, see what works and what doesn't, say in navigation or in a machine learning model. I can make these changes. Those changes live somewhere, but I haven't fundamentally altered my core taxonomy, which can be very important. Okay, so to get back to where we started, from taxonomy infancy to taxonomy maturity to taxonomy stability and eventual decline, having some best practices in concept and taxonomy lifecycle management reinforces practices allowing you to monitor and review your taxonomy. So it may achieve immortality as a giant glowing orbiting space embryo, or, like a really great taxonomy. So I think we're going to have a little time. Looks like I finished in a reasonable amount of time here. It seems like maybe we can take a few questions in between before James starts his session.
I don't have any questions yet. I think maybe people are still digesting. You were talking about immortality, and I was thinking back to the keynote that we had from the New York Times, and their tagging structure has been going since over 100 years. So they certainly don't do a lot of deleting or retiring because these things have a lot of historical importance. So you make a good point in that deleting is something that you do very rarely. But in what case would you say that deleting is a relevant action to take as part of the life cycle?
Yeah, I'd say probably more often this idea of deprecating or combining terms, because as things, I have worked in a vocabulary that was almost 100 years old, and it grows and it grows and it grows, and you get all these concepts that sort of maybe they just are not relevant as time goes on. They sort of lose a flavor. More often than not, the jargon changes and they're just irrelevant. Like nobody's going to look that up anymore. And typically deprecate it, you don't delete it, right?
Mm.
But there have been times where um, content was tagged with things in the past, and you probably still need to link to it in some way, but that term is, I mean, in vocabularies that are old, they can have terms that are just downright offensive, right? Like inappropriate. Like we don't really want to keep those. So you may choose to delete them. Because it's
Mm.
just it's gone down a wrong path. Um, and maybe they were user generated keywords that got in there and they definitely need
Mhm.
to be deleted. And maybe they were tagged to content. I mean, Stephanie, you've done a lot of taxonomy projects. There have been plenty of times where you've seen content where you said, hey, look, there's been one piece of content tagged with one term, and this term was just outrageous, and who knows where it came from. I'm going to delete it. Like
Mhm.
we're just going to get rid of it and retag that document. So there are cases for deletion, but typically it becomes a deprecation where you're saying not this term anymore. It's a used for,
Mhm.
point back to this new term.
One of the things that I find interesting to weigh is when to do ad hoc changes and when to do batch, and kind of what you were showing with these, dated versions, what sort of does tip the scale in your experience to adopt a batch approach to governance and taxonomy sort of releases?
Interesting. Um, yeah, I think so. So we've had some very interesting use cases come up from our clients where I mean we've always sort of come from the approach that you have one taxonomy. This is the master. This is what you're working from. Um, but they have had use cases where they said they really wanted to take a snapshot in time and keep that for reference because they're going to try something else. And I can actually attest to this from a project I did years ago where I had some notion of what they had done in the past, and they said, well, here we've changed the taxonomy to be this, and we want to change it to this other structure. And I said, I've looked back into the history and you tried that and didn't work very well. And you don't know you tried it because you didn't really pay attention to the fact that you had made alterations in your taxonomy. You've got no record really that you can view in one space and compare A to B and say, we tried this structure, and especially in e-commerce, right? You try one structure and it generates some sales, and then you change it, and then maybe things get better, maybe things get worse, and you want to revert back or you want to keep that change. So this idea of changing on a large scale, a merger and acquisition, that could be a good use case for we want to keep our taxonomy, but now we're going in a completely different direction, but we want to maintain our history. So we're making a lot of changes and it's an overhaul and we're going in a new direction. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
People keeping track if there's a drinking game, I'm
I think
sure.
there's two that I've noticed so far, but I'm not that I'm counting.
Shots, everyone. I was just going to say that in cases where in cases where we have a lot of like downstream systems and a lot of sort of technical testing that needs to get done whenever new stuff is released, that's often we'll do more of a batch approach for that, so that you're not constantly having to every 2 days get the IT team to do a bunch of testing. We have a question from Susan in the chat. Do you keep the old terms for alternates? When do you decide to deprecate versus hide in an alternate so that the user doesn't see
Yeah.
it, but someone might still be able to use it to search?
Yeah, it's a great question because that's so common. Often it's about getting back to that content, right? So especially when a term changes. So again, I worked in an organization where it was like 100 years worth of history and the terminology changed. So you can't going back and re-indexing and re-tagging that content's not really, it's not going to cut it. Like that's just not feasible. And it was actually published in hard copy. So you can't go back and re-index a book on a shelf in a library, right? It's just can't happen. So what you need to do is provide electronic access to it by saying, we used to use this, it's a used for now, it points to this other thing. And it has to be a choice, is the used for synonymous? Is it really, does it absolutely mean the same thing? If it does, then you can make it a synonymous label or an alt label and say these are really the same. Or is the notion really changed? Like we don't really think about it that way anymore. So we're going to have a used for pointer, but they're not equivalent. So you kind of have to make that decision and say what's the nature of these two or more concepts when you're either merging them or making them, equating them as being synonymous.
Especially when it's going to affect analytics or any kind of data aggregation that you're doing.
Right,
Definitely.
right.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thank
Going
you.
to pause and move things over to Jim, if you want to put your camera on, Jim. James is Senior Information Scientist at SmartLogic and is going to be talking to us about information governance as a service. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. And thanks for that great talk. I think I'm out of focus. My camera sometimes has trouble focusing on me. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Is that what it looks like?
You're a little fuzzy. So let's share your screen. I'm sure people will. There we go. Oh, almost.
My
There we
hand.
go.
All right.
There we go. You look good.
Okay, I'll share my screen so you don't have to look at me. All right.
You're unfuzzy now.
Okay. Okay. Okay, well, thanks. That was a great talk, really into the a lot of very specifics about the governance of concepts and terminology and the taxonomies and how they relate downstream. And so it was I really got a lot out of that, and I'm glad that my talk was more focused on kind of principles and approaches in managing a governance process, because I think it'll be complementary to what we were just looking at. Just a quick commercial. Visit us in the exhibit hall. We're going to be there at these times over the next couple days, but please always feel free to ping me or one of the other SmartLogic people here. We're happy to talk to you and go into more detail about SmartLogic Semaphore. I only talk about it in general terms here. And also our CEO, Jeremy Bentley, is presenting tomorrow afternoon. I encourage you to go see or tomorrow morning, sorry, about explainable AI. So, so we are talking about semantic models, information governance, and a service. A lot of different ideas there, but it's really how do semantic models drive governance? Less about the day-to-day operation, again, more about how you can position your operation. A little bit about me: information scientist, solution architect, systems librarian. I go by a few different titles depending on the situation. I've been at SmartLogic about 6 years. Before that, in a variety of organizations dealing with in libraries, informatics, content, taxonomy management functions, mostly in pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical research, but with some experience in academia and tech thrown in as well. And I owe all my success to my music degree. That's kind of a joke, but I like to think it's somewhat true. So we'll talk about SmartLogic a little bit, and then dive into semantic models and governance. And I'm going to draw on my experience as from working at my different organizations as well as at SmartLogic, which one of the reasons I really like it here is I get to work with a lot of organizations and all doing exciting things. So hopefully I can share some of that experience. But really, if I could draw it into some basic principles, it's about governing what matters. And don't govern what doesn't matter. And we'll talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. And when you think of your organization, what are the parts of the organizations you really need to support and focus on? My thoughts is look at the fringes of your organization. Look at the parts of the organizations that are moving quickly, that are the innovative parts. Focus on them. Leverage that tension in your governance process. Don't try to control it. Try to leverage it. And one way to get governance supported is to think of it as a service. You're helping people. You're helping them do their job. You're not trying to control or keep them from doing their job. It's a difference that might seem philosophical, but I think it's important. Smart Logic, very quickly, we were founded as a company about in 2006. We worked came to US, had our first customer in 2009, and Smart Logic 4, which is our semantic AI platform, was launched in 2015. We're just about to launch 5.4, which is really exciting. If you want to hear more about that, come talk to us. Semaphore is basically focuses on 3 different capabilities. One is managing the models. We've managed taxonomies and ontologies. We do that really well, but our focus is also on making them do more than just be taxonomies. So we have an engine that allows you to put the taxonomies to work, to classify content. That's one thing, to identify the topics in content. But it's also can be used to model other things like facts and context, and be able to draw that information out of documents using a combination of our rich rules-based engine and our NLP capabilities. And we're also about putting the semantics to work in people's processes. So the taxonomy is no good if it can only be looked at inside the taxonomy system. It has to be pushed out, and we have a set of services to allow it to be used very easily in a lot of different situations. Okay, that's Semaphore. So let's talk about semantic models. And this is Taxonomy Bootcamp, a lot of focus on taxonomies. We may talk about ontologies. The projects that we get involved in deal with a lot of different types of models, and we think about them in a wider context. One book that I was been reading, a little commercial for Seth Early's book, The AI-Powered Enterprise, is a really good book because it says the key to an AI-powered enterprise is ontologies. And by ontologies, he means in a very broad way. He says an ontology can include or be expressed as any of the following: a data model, a content model, information model, data content information architecture, master data, metadata. And an ontology is more than any one of these things. It's really he describes it as the master knowledge scaffolding of an organization, which I thought was a really cool phrasing. And it implies governance. Of course, you need to govern a scaffolding. It's holding the organization together, right? Well, the trouble is that it makes you think of it being very fixed. And as Aaron said before, it's a living object. It has to continue to grow, or it's not going to serve its use. Seth says it's not single static thing. It is never complete. It changes as the organization changes and as it's applied. So it's really, one of the messages here is really to focus on how your taxonomies are being used, and because they're just part of an overall information environment at your organization. So we see knowledge models adding value in all these different spheres, in terms of not just enriching search and content management, tagging things, but also extracting data, supporting metadata hubs, analytics, and things like knowledge graphs. So we can talk about aboutness tagging, extracting data from documents. So modeling context, it's a very different sense of an information model. Building metadata hubs out of that data that you extract and out of your ontologies. Putting together semantic data catalogs that connect your physical models your conceptual models and into your business glossaries and ontologies, ultimately leading to the ability to query across all these things and ultimately build knowledge graphs. We like to see Semaphore as being in this position to be able to build all the data you need for the graph to work. And that can be data from your databases that are semantically inconsistent, that need to be normalized. That can be data from documents. Often that's kind of a key missing piece. The data in your databases may not match what your documents say, is the fact. I'm going to pull up a lot of life sciences examples probably here, but like if your database says that your product has these adverse events, well, then your documents better say they have the same adverse events. So using this semantic capability to be able to answer those questions. So that's, I wanted to, semantic models is the term we're using because it's a very broad use of what we might mean by taxonomies or knowledge models, ontologies, glossaries. There's a lot of ways to use that general concept in your work. So think beyond just managing a taxonomy. You're managing an information architecture that can do a lot of different things, and that can be a way to make it your operation more visible and valuable to the business. So I think of governance, I think of information, taxonomies and semantic models. It's really about an information architecture solution. So my second book plug, the classic information architecture book, now in its 4th edition from a few years ago, from Rosenfeld, Morville, and Arango. And there's I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but at the heart of the book is this Venn diagram of users, context, and content. When you're thinking about building your governance model for your operation, for your taxonomy management operation, your metadata management operation, it's always useful to go back to this. And unless you consider these 3 areas, your solution is not going to be as effective as it could be. So, and if you read the book, context is about the politics, the organizational dynamics, the technology, the goals of the organization, the timing, the money that's available, and the technology itself, which I love that because the technology is really just another context. You're talking about information. That's the important part of your solution, the data that's essential to your business. Content, of course, is what we've been talking about, the metadata, the things we manage, but it's also the content that your customers are using. That's the information you really need to understand in order to produce an effective governance solution. And of course, users or customers or whatever appropriate name to call them, their workflows, use cases, their concerns, their principles, etc. So I'm going to dive into each of these real quickly. I'm going to start with context. And this is a picture that I keep on hand. It's been around a while. Gartner came up with it in 2008, and it was sort of prophetic then. Now I think it is reality when they talked about this migration of how we work from being a very centralized type of operation to organizations that are very fluid and interconnected, and what they call hyper-connected enterprise. So when you look up in this upper right-hand side, it's really, if this is what your organization looks like and is trying to operate as, then model your governance and model your information taxonomies, your semantic models accordingly. And we'll take a deeper look at that. And this is where I get into thinking about the fringes. It's these edges that are the most dynamic parts of this matrix that you want to be paying particular attention to. Another aspect of context, think about your principles. When you set up a governance operation, it's not just the day-to-day operation, the rules, what you're going to do with this term or version of the taxonomy. That's all. You have to do that. But my focus is on think about why are you doing it, and make sure you're not just doing it because it's good information practice. That's what you care about. What's the actual what are the principles of your organization? And I guarantee you they have principles. I mean, they have goals of the business and things, but there's principles about how to use data, how to use information successfully. And you really want, these are part of your selling pitch. Why do I need to fund this governance operation? Why do I need this? That's where you pull out the principles. And they should sound familiar to whoever's asking the question, because you're reflecting their own business principles back at them. A couple examples I have. Again, it's a little bit scientific or life sciences oriented, but I'm sure it's familiar across verticals or whatever business you're in. I'm sure many of you have heard of FAIR, the FAIR data practices. This came up a few years ago, came out of a scientific paper somebody saying, we really need to manage our data in science a little better. And they proposed these basic principles of making data findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And as someone that still calls themselves a librarian, I see those principles and I think, oh, well, that's nothing new, but a lot of it is new in terms of how they've applied it. And if you look at the details of it, you just look up FAIR principles, FAIR data principles, you can learn all about this. But there's a whole principle specifically around vocabularies and how vocabularies should be managed and their impact on the data that needs to be used and interoperable and reused. It's a really valuable thing to tap into, and for some of our clients where the people working with Semaphore, working with taxonomies, may have originally called themselves libraries or taxonomy management organizations or vocabulary team or something like that. They've renamed themselves as FAIR because that's such a popular, such a focus of a research organization. So tap into it. It is almost falling into our lap in terms of a set of principles that we could get behind and adopt. And so make yourself part of these principles. The other picture I have on here is specifically with life sciences, but really pharmaceutical development. But I mention it because FAIR is kind of universal, and it's about the reuse of information, which is usually what we think of. But in a regulated industry, any regulated industry, there's a very important fact of the first time you create this data, it has to be right. And you're putting data into a submission, or you're trying to get some approval, or you're being monitored or audited by the government. That information that is closely watched by regulations has to be right the first time. And so they have a different set of principles of the first levels: attributable, legible, contemporaneous, relevant to what you're doing, original, accurate. But they've added a few others that aren't on that graphic, like complete, consistent, enduring, available. Sometimes taxonomy functions get a little more traction with these people because they recognize the need for governance. They recognize the need for very well managed information. So it might be a place to start with if you've got a regulated function that needs that type of attention. But again, these principles just tie right into what you need, what we all know, what we're at this conference for, understand the benefits of having semantic models and well-governed semantic models. And I think, and here's the tension between the center and the fringe. These people just want the data managed well so they can reuse it, find it again. The the people working on these submissions, they don't really care about that. They need to get their information right. So you've got to have both at play that reflects the dynamic nature of different parts of your teams. So that's the context. I'm talking about principles and just the nature of the organization, how your governance structure should follow that. Customers, we can talk a little bit about. Obviously, they have accountability for their information. Now, notice they were originally users because that's what the information architecture Venn diagram uses users, but you may not want to use that. You might want to use customers or consumers, or I don't know, some other. It's best not to consider anybody the other. You're really part of the same team. So you might want to consider yourself a partner, something like that. But in any case, they have accountability for information. So think about and we Aaron talked a lot about that, about how people participate in the management of a taxonomy. And that's their accountability. But your job is not to be accountable for the information. Your job is to help them make their job easier. And that's what this discipline that we're in is all about. Getting back to content quickly, remember the hyper-connected enterprise, that picture I drew? I always like to show this, thinking about, well, how do taxonomies fit into the hyper-connected enterprise? Well, if you have one enterprise, one central enterprise, one taxonomy is going to do it. And that's how it used to be, one enterprise taxonomy. But as the organization grows, you want to reuse taxonomies that already exist. You might want to in-source vocabularies that are already published. So it starts to get a little more complex. Then you bring in other groups. You start to work with other databases and systems. Everything starts flowing around, and you're again, just like the enterprise itself, your vocabularies and taxonomies need to harness that. I don't want to say it needs to be replicated, because you don't want to replicate what might seem like chaos, but you want to. This is by design, so you want to enable it by providing federated governance models. Allowing the fringes to do what they need to do, give them incentives for participating in the center. One of our clients, the taxonomy manages the central corporate portal, so the place you go for all the information you need to do your job, your basic, company portal, and so there's a taxonomy that manages that. Those main hooks into the main portal, but it's a very big organization with a lot of different teams doing different things, and they let them do whatever they need to do. They create their own taxonomies for their own purposes. You encourage them to use the same tool, because that certainly makes the whole operation work better. But then the way they hook them into the center is be able to say, if you want your information to show up on the main portal, you just need to do one or two things. Just take some part of your taxonomy that you want people to connect to, and just attach it into the main branch of the taxonomy, of the overall taxonomy. And then, but beyond that, you can do whatever you want. You don't need to follow any rules. You can govern it how you need to do. But if you want to participate in the bigger team, you have to do a few things. And it's just a way to get people on board and not challenge you in terms of, why do we have this operation going on in the center of the organization? That has nothing to do with me. Well, make it have something to do with them. Talk their language, get them involved. Just more about the content. Federated governance. Don't manage content that isn't governed. Another client I was working with the other day managed business glossary, manages business acronyms, and they've been collecting them, as part of their process. And they kind of realized, well, a lot of these, nobody's taking ownership of these terms. Nobody in the business is taking accountability for these acronyms. So let's get them out of the way. So they have a process by which, things that aren't governed are things that they don't have commitment to from an owner. Or an organism, an owner could be a person, but more likely a team or a process or a division of the company or something. But if nobody's stepping up and get it out of the way, and we probably don't want to delete things, but in most cases, but deprecate them or move them to a holding place that that where they're not in the way, they're not taking up your resources. The last thing you want is for somebody to challenge you on the resources that you have for your governance process. And then they see you're managing something that, really you're spending time with information that really is not used, not valued in the company. So, just to reiterate what makes governance successful, it helps the business do their job. It's not about controlling them. It's helping them live up to their responsibilities in how they manage their information. You want the benefits of governance to be better than the cost. And that's where I started thinking of supporting it like a service and make it available to point of need. These are things that are helping people. So, if you're trying to get people to contribute to a taxonomy, put, the ability to request a new taxonomy term right when they need it. If they're trying to tag content and they have access to the taxonomy and and they're able to look up something and say, okay, this is the right term. But if they don't find it, give them the ability to request it right then and there while they're thinking about it. Make it part of their operations. And then support them, give them a place to call. Don't just roll out a governance process and say, okay, follow this or else. If people would just follow it, then we'd all be fine. That's not good enough. You have to support people in using whatever governance processes you set up. It's really important. Of course, that has to be resourced. So you have to make the case for resourcing. And if you can't get the support and the funding for an ongoing support of a taxonomy, then roll back the scope to the point where the business is willing to fund your solution. And if you know that a much bigger solution would be what the business really needs, but if they're not willing to support it, that ongoing support, and scale back, adjust your principles, adjust the scale. Don't build something that you can't maintain. That happens all the time. People build large vocabulary solutions, but forget that the more you build, the more you have to maintain. And you can't just farm it all out to the business. You need to, that those processes still have to be managed, and they take effort. So I think about running governance like a service. So you want measures, you want key performance indicators. This is what we're doing, all the things that define a good service. The only risk is you don't want the service to appear like a commodity. And unless it is a commodity. So, you might, if there's parts of what you're doing that could be outsourced, like don't reinvent a taxonomy that already exists. Bring the taxonomy from external sources instead of recreating something that already exists. That would be a simple way to express the fact that you are outsourcing what you can. But you want to remain strategic and not just be considered a commodity, because a commodity is not a bad thing, but a commodity is something that you've defined well enough that you can give to somebody else, somebody that's not part of your main strategic business. You want to remain, at least at the core, a strategic function, because that's the only way your taxonomy is going to remain attached to the business, seen as a strategic partner with the business. You've got to talk their language. There's things you can't outsource, and all these things we're talking about in terms of what a semantic model should be and how it's used. It's a strategic asset, and don't let anybody think of it differently. That's pretty much it. You know, I would encourage you to look at those FAIR principles. They could really help you. Seth Early is a master of operating governance, governance procedures for taxonomies and ontologies in very large businesses. It's a great book for that. I threw in RDA because I'm a librarian, and this is resource description and access. Librarians have been dealing with metadata from a service perspective, you know, in terms of helping people do what they need to do forever, and they're really good at it. And sometimes I'll dip into my old library stuff, and it's just very inspiring. And this is the latest, RDA is the latest effort by the librarian community to manage metadata in a very smart way. So, you know, this stuff is hard to do. Information management, taxonomy management, it's a profession. That's why we're here. But information management of accountability for information is everybody's job, you know, and it's a burden. Our job is to make that burden as light as possible. And so we're helping people do their job so they can get back to doing their main function, which is developing the next drug, designing, selling products, running the company, running teams. They shouldn't be, don't let them be distracted by, you know, information that they're supposed to be managing. Make that transparent, make that easy for them. Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Great. We have a question from Yumiko about KPIs. So thinking about this sort of enterprise semantic model, what kinds of ways can you measure the success of your model, especially when you're thinking about this hyper-connected enterprise that go beyond the kind of typical improving search metrics or that kind of very tactical point? So what other KPIs do you look at for this level of governance?
Yeah, I suggest thinking of what are the key performance indicators of the customers, of the consumers of the taxonomy. How do they measure success? And you know, tie into that. If they're, you know, if their objectives are to you know, produce 10 more, you know, candidate products to move into the next stage, well, those 10 products, you know, dive into what goes into that process to get to that point. And there's you know, what ontologies do they use to do their, I'm slipping into life sciences here, but what vocabularies and such do they use to develop the next drug? There's all kinds of information processes that they use. I guess my message is don't just tap into you know, your operation. You know, you are doing this. It's you know, how many things have you done this week versus next week? Now, I expect to do 10 more taxonomies next year, so I'm going to need these more resources. Always put it in terms of the indicators of the of your customers, of the business.
Excellent, thank you, James. I have a question about, you know, you're talking about don't treat taxonomy like a commodity, and I feel like when organizations kind of hit this critical mass around enterprise taxonomy, people start looking at the taxonomy platform or taxonomy service as just a place. Like, oh, can we put our taxonomy for use case XYZ into the platform? Well, no other group really needs to use this taxonomy, but it's easier for us to just consume it via an API. So how do you make the distinction between what's considered that sort of shared strategic asset versus people trying to use your service as just a convenient way to be able to distribute terminology that isn't necessarily shared, if that makes sense?
I think that part of that is allowing for federated governance. If your tool supports them creating a vocabulary that they manage, and you can do that in a way that doesn't impede the rest of your operation, then let them do it. If they don't manage it, then it won't be useful to them or anybody. But it's not interfering with the rest of the operation. So it gets back to the fringes, allowing those parts of the organization to do what they want. But it sounds like you're saying they don't want to manage them themselves. That's why they're giving it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And and in that case, it comes down to you have to spell out very clearly what it would take to manage that information. It may sound simple. Here's a list of 1,000 acronyms. I'm going to give them to you so I can keep them somewhere and I can look them up when I need to. They have to commit to a review cycle or something. We're going to go back. We're going to look at this again in a year or whatever time frame. And if nothing's changed in it and nobody's using it, we're going to stop governing it. Maybe there's some trial period like that. But yeah, you don't want to be managing something that's doesn't have governance somewhere.
Indeed. Great. Well, we're just about at time, but thank you very much, James and Aaron, for those deep dives into governance topics. And thank you to all of you here for participating today and asking all these great questions. We'll be back at it tomorrow morning. Our first session starts at 9 a.m. And then it's interspersed with some KM World keynote stuff. And then we start up again with the rest of the program in the afternoon. So hopefully see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.